There is a fundamental principle in naval power that has governed the world for centuries. Whoever controls the seas controls commerce, and whoever controls commerce controls the destiny of nations. For 80 years, the United States enjoyed an unprecedented privilege, unrestricted access to all strategic ports in the Western Hemisphere. No nation in modern history had achieved such dominance. From the Panama Canal to Brazil's Atlantic ports, the United States' Fourth Fleet sailed as if the ocean were its private property. But this week, that historical privilege just ended. The government of Brazil, under President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, has closed access for U.S. military vessels to 5 strategic Brazilian ports. We're not talking about a minor diplomatic dispute. We're talking about the closure of the ports of Santos, Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, Recife, and Manaus to the most powerful navy in the world. Santos alone handles 28% of all maritime trade in South America. This is the port that connects Brazil with Asia, with Africa, with the emerging multipolar world. What the corporate media doesn't want you to know is that this closure is not an isolated act of Brazilian nationalism. It's the culmination of a coordinated strategy with China and Russia that began in 2023, when Brazil and China signed agreements to trade directly in yuan and reais, completely eliminating the dollar. Now, Admiral John Aquilino, commander of the United States Southern Command, faces a logistical nightmare. How do you project naval power in the South Atlantic when your main logistical ally has just closed the doors? I worked at the IMF for years. I've seen how the empire handles crises. And let me tell you something, when a historic ally closes its ports to you, it's not diplomacy. It's a declaration of strategic independence. To understand why Brazil is doing this now, we need to remember exactly how the United States has treated Latin America for decades. And when I say treated, I mean dominated, exploited, and when necessary, destroyed. Let's start with Brazil itself. In 1964, the United States orchestrated the military coup against democratically elected President João Goulart. The reason? Goulart wanted to nationalize foreign oil refineries and limit remittances of U.S. corporate profits. The CIA, under Operation Brother Sam, provided complete logistical support. The U.S. admiral who coordinated the plan even had a naval task force positioned off the Brazilian coast in case the coup needed assistance. The result? 21 years of military dictatorship that tortured more than 20,000 Brazilians and murdered 434 documented citizens. But Brazil hasn't been the only one. Look at Chile in 1973. The United States spent $8 million, documented by the U.S. Senate's Church Committee, to destabilize Salvador Allende's government. Henry Kissinger explicitly said, "I don't see why we should stand by and let a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people." Those were his exact words. On September 11, 1973, Augusto Pinochet took power. More than 3,000 Chileans were killed or disappeared. Another 40,000 were tortured in secret detention centers. Fast forward to Nicaragua in the 80s. The United States financed the Contras with $400 million between 1982 and 1989. These paramilitary groups planted landmines in Nicaraguan ports, destroyed health clinics, burned agricultural cooperatives. The International Court of Justice in The Hague condemned the United States in 1986 for unlawful use of force. The United States simply ignored the ruling and vetoed any Security Council resolution that attempted to enforce it. Let's talk about Venezuela more recently. In 2019, the United States attempted a coup d'etat by backing Juan Guaidó as interim president. They froze $342 billion in Venezuelan assets. They confiscated Citgo, the Venezuelan oil company valued at $8 billion. They imposed more than 930 individual sanctions against Venezuelan officials. They offered a $15 million reward for the capture of Nicolas Maduro as if he were an Old West criminal. The objective was clear: collapse the Venezuelan economy until the people, desperate and hungry, would overthrow their own government. And let's not forget Argentina. In 2001, when Argentina faced the worst economic collapse in its history, the IMF, under the direction of U.S. Treasury officials, refused to provide emergency loans unless Argentina privatized its last state-owned companies and raised public service rates by 600%. Millions fell into poverty overnight. The United States and the IMF said it was fiscal responsibility. Argentinians called it economic genocide. This has been the relationship. Washington dictates, Latin America obeys, or faces the consequences. Military coups, devastating economic sanctions, covert interventions, assassinations of leaders, systematic destabilization. For 70 years, Latin American governments that attempted independent economic policies were brutally punished. So what happened? Why does Brazil now dare to close its ports to the U.S. Navy? Why is Mexico buying Venezuelan oil in yuan? Why has Argentina just joined BRICS? The answer is simple. The stick no longer works when you have alternatives, and China has provided that alternative. Let's now talk about the crisis Washington faces. And when I say crisis, I'm not talking about a diplomatic problem that can be resolved with a phone call or a summit. I'm talking about a structural collapse of the United States power projection capability in the hemisphere. Admiral John Aquilino, commander of the United States Southern Command, has an impossible problem. His annual budget is $1.2 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, right? But compare it to the Indo-Pacific Command, which receives $7.1 billion, or the European Command with $4.8 billion. Latin America has historically been the backyard where the United States could operate with minimal budgets because no one challenged its hegemony. Now that paradigm has collapsed. Aquilino needs to maintain naval presence throughout Latin America, from the Caribbean to the Strait of Magellan. That's more than 20 million square kilometers of ocean to patrol. And he just lost access to Brazil's 5 most important strategic ports: Santos, Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, Recife, Manaus. These ports aren't just places to refuel. They're complete logistical centers where the U.S. Navy stores equipment, performs maintenance, and coordinates intelligence operations. But if the situation with Brazil is embarrassing, the situation in Washington is absolutely terrifying. The United States currently spends $886 billion annually on defense. It's more than the next 10 countries combined. But here's the secret nobody in the Pentagon wants to admit. 62% of that budget goes to maintaining obsolete systems and military pensions. Only 14% is invested in new technology and power projection capability. Meanwhile, China has invested $1.7 trillion in port infrastructure in Latin America since 2005. It's not military money, it's infrastructure money. China is building the ports that will eventually replace those the United States just lost. In Peru, China built the port of Chancay with an investment of $3.5 billion. This port can handle the largest container ships in the world. It directly connects Peru with Shanghai in 23 days of navigation. And the United States has absolutely nothing comparable on the west coast of South America. Secretary of State Antony Blinken traveled to Brazil last month. His message? We're concerned about Chinese influence in the region. Lula responded with a devastating statement. The United States had 200 years to develop our infrastructure. China did it in 15 years. Who should I worry about? Now let's face the absolute irony of the American position. For decades, Washington preached free trade, market opening, non-interference in sovereign commercial decisions. Let the market decide, they said. Eliminate protectionist barriers, they insisted. They forced Latin America to completely open their economies to American capital under threat of sanctions and isolation. And now that China offers better terms, better interest rates, real infrastructure instead of conditional loans, the United States is furious. They're demanding that Brazil and other Latin American countries reject Chinese investment for national security reasons. It's exactly the protectionist and interventionist policy that the United States condemned for decades when other countries practiced it. And here's the final trap. You can't declare war on your own banker. China owns $859 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. It's the second largest holder of U.S. debt after Japan. If China decides to sell those bonds, U.S. interest rates would skyrocket, the dollar would collapse, and the U.S. economy would enter an immediate recession. The United States cannot militarily pressure countries that trade with China without risking a Chinese financial counterattack that would be devastating. The Pentagon knows it. The Treasury Department knows it. That's why Washington's threats sound increasingly hollow. Brazil closed the ports because they correctly calculated that the United States can't do anything significant about it without triggering a financial crisis that Washington can't afford. Power projection requires bases, requires logistics, requires willing allies. The United States is losing all three simultaneously in Latin America.